The cold was a living thing in the town of Providence, a predator that gnawed at the seams of worn wool and settled deep in the bone. For Eliza, it was indistinguishable from the shame. It coiled in her stomach, a frozen serpent, as she stood on the splintered planks of the auction platform before the mercantile. The air, thick with the scent of wet mud and coal smoke, carried the low murmurs of the townsfolk, a jury of hard faces and harder hearts. Her son, Leo, clutched the folds of her skirt, his small hand a desperate anchor in a churning sea of public scorn. He was 5 years old, his world shrunken to the space between her trembling legs and the hostile stares of strangers. Pinned to her dress, just above her heart, was a square of cardstock. Another was fastened to Leo's small coat. On them, in the stark, unforgiving ink of Constable Reed, were numbers. Not their names, not their story, but the sum of her late husband's debt. Thomas had been a good man, but the mountain was cruel and the fever that took him was crueler. It had left Eliza with nothing but his obligations and a silence in her cabin that was louder than any storm. Now, that debt had a price tag, and she and her son were the goods. They were being sold into indenture, their years of labor offered to the highest bidder to settle the account at the general store. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the boardwalk, a dark speck in a world of gray. To look up was to meet the gazes of people she had known for years. She saw Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife, her lips pressed into a thin line of sanctimonious pity. She saw men who had shared a drink with Thomas, now assessing her with a cold, mercantile calculus. How many years of mending and scrubbing was she worth? How much strength was in her boy's small frame for future chores? The humiliation was a physical force, pressing the air from her lungs. She could feel Leo shivering, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying energy of the crowd. She laid a hand on his head, a gesture that felt impossibly frail against the weight of their judgment. "Let us begin," Constable Reed announced, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "The debt stands at $67. We open the bidding for the indenture of the woman, Eliza, and the boy, Leo. A term of 5 years, or until the debt is worked clear." A man in the front row, a farmer with hands like cured leather, called out, "$20 for the pair." He was looking at her arms, her shoulders. Eliza felt like a mare being sized up for plow work. Another voice, higher and meaner, countered him. The bidding began its slow, degrading crawl, each offer a fresh lash of indignity. They were bartering for her life, for her son's childhood, and she was forced to stand and listen. Despair was a taste in her mouth, metallic and bitter. This was how it ended, not in the quiet dignity of grief, but here under the weight of a leaden sky, with a price tag on her soul. Then, a shift in the crowd parted the sea of bodies. A figure emerged from the edge of the square, moving with a deliberate quiet that drew every eye. He was tall and broad, clad in buckskin and furs that had seen hard seasons. His face, framed by a dark beard, was weathered by wind and sun, his expression unreadable. It was Silas, the mountain man. He lived alone, deep in the timberlands, a figure of local legend and suspicion. He traded pelts for salt, flour, and bullets, his words as sparse as his visits. The townsfolk watched him, their chatter ceasing. His presence was an interruption, a stone dropped into the placid water of their cruelty. He walked to the front of the platform, his gaze not on the auctioneer, but on the small, crude price tags pinned to her and Leo. He stopped, and he said nothing. The silence that followed was different from the hush that had fallen before. It was heavy, accusatory. Silas's eyes, the color of a winter sky, moved from the tag on her chest to the one on her son's coat. He saw the tremble in her hands, the terror in Leo's wide eyes. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze, a tightening at the corner of his mouth. He did not look at the constable nor at the bidders. He looked only at them, at the public display of their dispossession. He stood there for a full minute, a statue of silent rebuke. The crowd grew restless under the weight of his quiet. Their smugness began to curdle into discomfort. What was he doing? Why was he just looking? His stillness was more powerful than any outburst. It held a mirror up to them, and in its reflection, their casual brutality was laid bare. Constable Reed cleared his throat, his authority wavering. Do you have a bid, Silas? Or are you just here to obstruct the proceedings? Silas finally moved his gaze to the constable. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and drew out a small, heavy deerskin bag. He tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a solid, metallic thunk that echoed in the unnatural quiet. $70, Silas said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it carried across the square. For the debt. Not for them. He then turned his gaze back to the crowd, sweeping it over the faces of the farmers, the merchants, the gossips. He held their eyes one by one. His silence returned, more profound than before. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a cold, righteous anger that needed no words. It shamed them. It shamed their smallness, their greed. In the face of his quiet dignity, their chattering bids and self-righteous justifications were exposed for the pathetic cruelties they were. Men shuffled their feet. Women looked away, suddenly finding the gray sky fascinating. The farmer who had opened the bidding stared at the mud on his boots. Silas's silence had not just ended the auction. It had passed a judgment far more severe than any court could offer. Constable Reed, flustered, opened the pouch. The glint of gold and silver coins confirmed the amount. He straightened up, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. The debt is paid, he announced to the silent town. He looked at Eliza as if expecting her to show gratitude, but she could only stare at the man in buckskin who had bought her freedom, not her servitude. Silas stepped onto the platform, his movements careful and deliberate. He knelt in front of Leo, who flinched back against Eliza's legs. Silas didn't speak. He simply reached out a calloused finger and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his bearing, he unpinned the price tag from the boy's coat. He folded it once and tucked it away. Then he stood and did the same for Eliza, his knuckles brushing against her worn dress. The brief touch was not familiar, yet it was not threatening. It was methodical, final. He was removing the mark of their shame. He straightened up, holding the 2 crude tags in his palm. He looked at them for a moment, then closed his fist around them. Without another word, he turned and gestured with his head toward the path leading out of town, the one that wound up into the mountains. It wasn't a command, but an invitation. Path away from this place. Eliza hesitated for only a second. She took Leo's hand, her own no longer trembling, and stepped off the platform, leaving the silent, shamed town behind her. The journey to Silas's cabin was a silent one, measured by the crunch of their boots on the frost-hardened trail and the rhythm of their breathing in the thin, cold air. Eliza followed a few paces behind him, Leo's hand held tight in hers. Her fear had not vanished, but it had changed its shape. The sharp terror of the auction block had receded, replaced by a deep, uncertain watchfulness. This man, this near stranger, had paid a fortune to clear her name, yet he had offered no explanation, no demand. His back was a wide, unreadable landscape of buckskin and solitude. He walked with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in tune with the harsh rhythms of the wild, a life far removed from the petty cruelties of Providence. She studied him, searching for clues. The way he paused to shift a fallen branch from their path. The way his head tilted, listening to the forest sounds she couldn't discern. These were the actions of a man at home in a world that terrified most. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and gray into the sky. The cabin was small, sturdy, built of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the darkening pines. It was an image of shelter, of warmth, but the uncertainty remained. Inside, a fire already crackled in the hearth. The single room was sparse but clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A bed, built into the wall and piled with furs, occupied one corner. There was a scent of pine, wood smoke, and something else, cured meat, maybe herbs. Silas gestured toward the fire. Warm the boy, it was the first thing he had said to her since the town square. He took a bucket and headed back outside toward a stream she could hear nearby, leaving her alone with her son in the sudden, enveloping warmth. Eliza knelt and began to unbutton Leo's coat, her fingers clumsy. The boy looked around the small space, his eyes wide. He was not afraid, she realized, but curious. In a child's simple way, he had already accepted this man's protection. When Silas returned, he set the bucket of water near the hearth without a word. He took a slab of dried venison and a hunk of bread from a sack, placing them on the table. He then picked up a spare blanket and one of the thickest furs from the bed. He went to the far corner of the cabin, a space of bare floorboards, and laid them out. He was making a pallet for himself. It was then that Eliza understood. He had given them the bed. He had given them the warmest spot by the fire. He was offering them sanctuary, not demanding service. This quiet, powerful act spoke more clearly than any proclamation. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. She watched him settle onto the floor, turning his back to them to afford her a measure of privacy. The firelight played over his broad shoulders as he lay down, a sentinel in his own home. Eliza slowly guided Leo to the bed, tucking him under the heavy, warm furs. She sat for a long time on the edge, watching the flames dance, listening to the two different patterns of breath in the small cabin. Her son's, soft and even in sleep, and the man's, steady and slow from the floor. For the first time in months, the serpent of shame in her belly began to uncoil. In the profound silence of the mountain cabin, surrounded by the deep woods, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead: safety. The seasons turned, painting the mountains in the stark white of winter and then the tentative green of spring. Life with Silas settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Words were rare, but communication was constant. It was in the stack of firewood he left by the door each morning, in the pot of stew she kept warm for him on the hearth. It was in the small wooden bird he carved for Leo, its wings outstretched in silent flight, and in the way Leo would run to the door when he heard Silas's returning footsteps, a trust forged without promises or pronouncements. Eliza found her strength returning, not just in her body, but in her spirit. She learned the mountain's language, the meaning of a hawk's cry, the taste of clean water from the spring, the signs of a coming storm. She worked beside him, not for him, tending the small garden she'd planted, mending his buckskins, preserving the meat he brought back from his hunts. They were partners, their roles defined not by transaction but by necessity and a growing mutual respect. The memory of the auction block faded, the price tags becoming a distant, ugly dream. Here, her worth was measured in her resilience, in her ability to make a home in the heart of the wilderness. She was no longer the broken widow from Providence. She was a woman of the mountain. One afternoon, as a late summer sun slanted through the tall pines, their peace was shattered. The sharp, unfamiliar sound of shod horses on the trail made them both freeze. Silas, who had been splitting logs, slowly lowered his axe. Eliza came to the cabin door, Leo peeking out from behind her skirts. Through the trees, three figures emerged. Constable Reed, his face set in a mask of grim authority, and beside him Mr. Gable, the store owner, his expression a mixture of greed and resentment. A brutish-looking man Eliza didn't know brought up the rear. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their presence a violation of the quiet sanctuary. "Silas," the constable called out, his voice loud and jarring in the tranquil air. "We've come on official business." Mr. Gable slid from his horse, his eyes immediately finding Eliza. "There's been a miscalculation," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. "A debt overlooked. The indenture contract is still valid. We've come for what's ours. It was a lie, a transparently greedy fabrication, but the constable's presence gave it the veneer of law. They believed that here, far from the town, they held all the power. They saw a lone woman and a silent mountain man. They saw an easy victory. Eliza felt a flash of the old fear, cold and sharp, but it was different now. It was mixed with a hot surge of fury. This life, this peace was hers. It was Leo's. She pulled her son behind her, her body a shield. "You have no claim on us," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The debt was paid." "That's a matter for the magistrate to decide," Reed said dismissively, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Get your things. You and the boy are coming back with us." Gable took a step forward, his eyes glinting. "I'll get more work out of you than he ever did." It was then that Silas moved. He didn't reach for the axe. He didn't shout. He simply walked and stood between them and the cabin door. He was not armed, save for the hunting knife at his belt. He just stood there, his feet planted in the earth, as immovable as the mountain behind him. And he was silent. He looked at Gable, then at the constable. His silence was not passive. It was a challenge, a wall of absolute refusal. It was the same silence from the town square, but this time it was not meant to shame. It was meant to warn. It hummed with a dangerous energy, the stillness of a predator before it strikes. The men felt it. Gable's smirk faltered. The constable's hand tightened on his weapon. "Step aside, Silas," Reed commanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "This isn't your concern." Silas remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He was making them state their purpose, forcing them to voice their own corruption in the clean mountain air. Their blustering words echoed and died, sounding hollow and weak against his profound stillness. Their authority, so absolute in the town, meant nothing here. Here they were intruders, and the man before them was the mountain's law. Gable, his patience gone, finally broke. He lunged forward, reaching for Eliza's arm. Enough of this, the movement was a mistake. Silas moved with a speed that was terrifying. In a single, fluid motion, he stepped forward, deflected Gable's arm, and had the man's wrist locked in an iron grip. Gable cried out, his face paling in pain and shock. The hired man started to draw his pistol, but froze when Silas's eyes, now as cold and hard as river stones, locked onto him. The hunter's knife was suddenly in Silas's other hand, its tip resting just under Gable's chin. The entire confrontation had taken less than 3 seconds. Still, Silas had not uttered a sound. The silence stretched, filled only by Gable's whimpering and the pounding of Eliza's heart. The constable stood frozen, his hand on his gun but his courage gone. He saw now what the town had only ever suspected, that Silas was not just a quiet recluse, but a man of deep and formidable power, a man who would kill to protect what was his. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice a low growl that was part of the forest itself. "Leave." It was a single word, an absolute command. He released Gable, shoving him back so he stumbled and fell to the ground. Silas never took his eyes off the constable. The shamed silence descended again, but here it was laced with fear. Reed and his hired man looked at the whimpering merchant on the ground, then at the unmoving figure of Silas. They saw the woman behind him, her chin high, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire they had never seen before. They were defeated not by a volley of bullets, but by the unbreakable will of two people who had nothing left to lose and a world to protect. Without another word, the constable helped a limping Gable onto his horse. They turned their backs and rode away, their retreat hasty and humiliating. They did not look back. The sounds of their horses faded, swallowed by the immense quiet of the woods. The threat was gone. The air, once thick with tension, slowly settled. Leo, who had been hiding behind Eliza's skirts, peeked out, his small face a mask of awe. Eliza stepped forward, her eyes locked on Silas, who still stood watching the trail, his body taut. He slowly sheathed his knife, the simple sound marking the end of the conflict. He turned to face her. His expression was impossible to read, but in the depths of his eyes, she saw the dying embers of a protective fury. She saw the question, too. "Are you all right?" She didn't need him to say it. She simply nodded, a wave of profound emotion, gratitude, relief, and a deep, aching tenderness welling up inside her. He had not just protected her body. He had defended her life, the one they had painstakingly built together from the ashes of her old one. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the silence of strangers sharing a space, but the comfortable, breathing quiet of a family. As Silas sat by the fire, cleaning his knife with a piece of oiled leather, Eliza noticed a deep gash on his forearm, a scrape from Gable's belt buckle she hadn't seen before. She went to the small chest where she kept herbs and clean linen. Without a word, she knelt beside him. He stopped his work and watched her as she gently took his arm. His skin was rough, calloused from work and weather, but he held perfectly still as she cleaned the wound and wrapped it carefully. Her touch was gentle, her movements sure. It was a simple act of care, an echo of the countless unspoken kindnesses he had shown her. When she finished, her hand lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. He looked from her hand to her face, and for the first time, she did not look away. In his gaze, she saw the story the town could never know. A story of loss, of solitude, of a quiet man who understood the true meaning of value. He had seen the price tag they had put on her soul and had paid it off not with coin, but with dignity. He had given her a home, but she had given him one in return, filling the silent cabin with a life he had likely thought he would never know. They had saved each other. She had arrived a refugee from the world of men. Now, she was the unyielding heart of this small, fierce world of their own. A home is not four walls, she thought, looking from the sleeping form of her son to the steadfast man beside her. It is a place where you are safe, where you are seen. And here, on this mountain, under the silent watch of the pines, she was finally home.